Okay, hello. This week I wanted to talk about the Stalinization and the coming to power of the communist parties in Central and Eastern Europe. We've looked now at the interwar period, and we've looked at the Second World War, and we've seen how the interwar period was a failure in many respects, but the Second World War was really a huge humanitarian and political and economic and military catastrophe for many people in Central and Eastern Europe. And we'd also talked a little bit about how many parts of pre-war political society in Eastern and Central Europe had compromised themselves by collaborating with the Axis powers, and of course at the end of the Second World War, when the Axis powers were defeated, those collaborators found themselves in very difficult positions. In fact, most of them were completely discredited, and would now be facing some kind of justice at the end of the Second World War, imprisonment, or in many cases, of course, execution. And then we talked about the resistance, didn't we? And we sort of looked at two variations of resistance. We looked at the governments in exile, mostly democratic governments that arrived in London during the Second World War, and we saw how they tried to coordinate some sort of resistance to the Axis powers. And we looked at those, and at the end, we talked more, didn't we, about the communists. We started to talk about them, and we looked at how they had a different kind of a different approach to resistance, much more confrontational. Much more willing in many cases to endure reprisals, or to sort of allow reprisals to fall upon the general population, and of course in many cases the communists believed that those reprisals would radicalize people towards the communist cause, would sort of push them away from simply passively accepting the occupation. Now we'll be talking more about them today, and in these two sessions, I want to talk about how the communists took power at the end of the Second World War. Now, the Soviet Union plays a very large part, and of course, its leader at this point, until his death in 1953, is Stalin. And the personality of Stalin, the policies of Stalin, play a very important role in what is to happen next. It must be understood, of course, it must be remembered that Stalin at the end of the Second World War was in many respects at the peak of his powers. It was not only that he'd sort of, from the 1930s onwards, eliminated any meaningful opposition within the Soviet Union, from Trotsky down to Bukharin and Zinoviev, and anyone else who might sort of oppose his rule in any meaningful way, but also because of his role in the Second World War, and because of the alliance that he had forged with the Allied powers, with the Western powers, France, Great Britain, and the United States, and because of the military victories of the Red Army, the Soviet Union and Stalin were really at an all-time high at the end of the Second World War. Not only extremely powerful, but extremely well regarded, not just by the communists, who of course had always worshipped him, but also by many democratically minded people who were impressed at this kind of mobilization, and impressed at the successes of Stalin's war. Now there is that, and I guess I sort of mentioned those things only because there is certainly an element of coercion, a very large element of coercion in the way the communist parties come to power in Eastern and Central Europe. It's in countries like Poland, for example, to a certain extent in countries like Bulgaria or Hungary or Romania. Where the communist parties have been relatively small before the Second World War. Stalin wanted to exert influence over those countries in one way or the other, and in order to install communist parties, he needed to exercise quite a lot of power, quite a lot of coercion. These were not natural fits within the countries in question. But nevertheless, there were many people at this stage, for various reasons, having gone through the failures of the interwar period, the economic crisis, which was essentially a crisis of capitalism in the 1930s, and then having gone through the horrors of the Second World War, the horrors of occupation, the horrors of Nazism, there were many people who now believed that this, that perhaps communism and Stalin and the Soviet Union could offer a brighter alternative. And in the second session, we're going to look at what I think is a very interesting case study. We're going back to an individual. We're going to talk about Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet and Nobel laureate, and we're going to talk about how he responded to communism. He was one of the supporters initially, but he also talks about how many of his friends who had been critical thinkers and who had not, perhaps in many cases, been particularly sympathetic towards communism, could find themselves as such at the end of the Second World War. And I guess the aim of these two sessions is really to try to muddy the waters a little bit, to try to show that this was a very difficult period in Central and Eastern European history, as it was in world history. And also to show that the Communist Party, for many people and for very, very many different reasons, seemed to offer a brighter future, seemed to offer a way out of this labyrinth, a way out of this this chaos and this confusion. Okay, so let's look at the slideshows, and let me put up, as always, you may have noticed that I'm also putting in the numbers as we go. Let's then look at slide number 2. This is the Soviet Union, of course, turned communist during the October Revolution, the subsequent civil war from 1917 until the early 1920s. And in the interwar period, and indeed during the Second World War, had been essentially the only communist country. There had been other communist revolutions in Europe at the end of the First World War. In 1914, of course, there would be Mao's revolution in China. But at the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union was the only communist state in the world, the only country that had had a successful and long-lasting communist revolution. Now, as a result of that, communists across the world really looked up to the Soviet Union. Throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, they were in awe of what the Bolsheviks, they believed the Bolsheviks had achieved in the Soviet Union. And of course, at this time, little was known of the terror. There was the Moscow show trials, but the communists could still persuade themselves that the people who had been put on trial, Bukharin and Zinoviev, Kalinin, that they were probably, if Stalin said they were guilty, and if those men themselves said they were guilty, then they probably were. Guilty. So the Soviet Union was the great beacon for the communist world, and it had become even more of a beacon, as I said earlier, because of its military successes during the Second World War. And it really was, of course, I try not to take too strong opinions about this, but it really was the Red Army which was the decisive factor in the victories of the Second World War, whether we like it or not. More than anything, it was Hitler's failures to sort of take those great cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad, today's Volgograd and St. Petersburg, and then the successful Red Army pushed back out of the to push the Wehrmacht back out of the country, and then to push into Berlin, which was really the decisive factor in the victory of the Allies during the Second World War. So the Soviet Union was at the peak of its prestige, and as I said, if we turn to slide number 3, the man of the hour, the supposed genius of this of these great victories was Stalin. He had it was him. It was believed more than anyone who had orchestrated these victories. He had led the Soviet Union since the late 1920s. Many people saw him at this time as the natural successor of Lenin. Lenin, of course, had been dead since the mid 1920s. And the Soviet Union, with Stalin at the helm, seemed to be the great force on world politics. Now, if we turn to slide 4, sticking with Stalin and sticking with what had happened, during the Second World War. Although the Soviet Union had won this war, although they had emerged victorious, they had done so at a very high price. The Soviet Union had suffered around 20 million casualties, between 20 and 25 million. Many of those people were non-combatants, but about half of them probably were non-soldiers. It's very difficult to say for sure. Because there was, there was guerrilla warfare, there was partisan warfare in places like Belarus, in places like Russia, and the lines between military combatants and non-combatants and civilians were quite blurred. But nevertheless, in the entirety of the Second World War, about 60 million people had been killed, 60 to 65 million people. And of those, 20 million, 25 million had come out of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union had emerged victoriously, but they had done so at a terrible price. And of course, there was also huge destruction in places like Moscow and Petersburg, and those great European Russian cities, and in Ukraine and in places like Kiev and Lviv. Which at the time, of course, were part of the Soviet Union. The country had suffered very terribly. Now Stalin and his personality, of course, were of paramount importance in the way the country was run, in the way the Soviet Union is run. And it's highly likely, given what we know of Stalin's track record, that Stalin was congenitally quite a paranoid person, seeing enemies everywhere, seeing threats everywhere. But at the end of the Second World War, his paranoia and his obsessions with security had grown many times. In 1945, as Stalin now approached the peace tables in places like Potsdam, in places like Yalta, Stalin's obsession was with the possibility of Germany re-emerging from the ashes. At the time, Stalin and many others did not understand the totality of Hitler's defeat. They didn't understand how devastating this defeat was, and instead they thought about Germany in 1918 after the First World War. Again, Germany had seemed to be on its feet, on its knees. Germany seemed to have been completely defeated, and yet within the space of 10 years, then 15 and 20 years under Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, the Germanies had Germany had risen once again and was able to wage for a period a very successful war in the world and of course particularly in Europe. So Stalin thought that this defeat was deceptive, and he believed that within 5 or 10 years, the Soviet Union would be once again facing potentially a resurgent, once again more powerful Germany, and that this was people shouldn't trust the extent of the German defeat because people had seen already how Germany had successfully got back onto its feet at the end of the First World War. So Stalin looked at, if you're following me, Stalin looked at what had happened in the Soviet Union. He looked at the 20 to 25 million casualties. He looked at the deep penetration of the Wehrmacht right up to Moscow, right up to the great centers of Soviet power in the Western Soviet Union, and he was very fearful that this could happen again. Now, Stalin had really shifted positions internationally. The Soviet Union had not been particularly engaged in international affairs, international relations in the interwar period, but now decisively it was. He had been part of an alliance with Churchill and with Roosevelt, now Truman, the American president. He was much more sort of global player now. He was sitting at the big table. He was discussing with non-communists and Democrats, what might emerge out of this rubble. And for Stalin, it was desperately important that whatever did emerge, he would be able to secure his western borders, that he could push the borders somehow of the Soviet Union, if not territorially, then at least sort of ensure that there was a buffer zone of friendly states, of Soviet-influenced states that could protect from sort of further invasion, further attack. Now, many people have commented that this is not a new practice for Russia, that this was not a new practice for Russia, that if we go back to the period of the Russian Empire, before the First World War and during the First World War, imperial practices were quite similar. The Tsars, the Romanov Tsars, successively, and particularly in the 19th century, were concerned about the Balkans, concerned about the West, concerned about Central Asia, and wanting to sort of treat those areas as if they were their sort of their own backyard, their own territory, the areas from which they were likely to be attacked by Prussia or by the by the Ottoman Empire, or by of course by the Japanese Empire from 1905 onwards. So many people have made the point that despite this revolution, and despite this dramatic shift from this sort of conservative empire, autocratic empire, into a radical left-wing Bolshevik state that the Soviet Union made from 1917 onwards, nevertheless, Stalin and the Soviet Union was still behaving with this kind of imperial mindset. There are some people, I wouldn't be one of them, but there are people who claim that sort of current politics in Russia in the 21st century is also marked by this kind of imperial practice and imperial attitude. But anyway, Stalin was concerned, and Stalin wanted to ensure, perhaps understandably, that there would be no future problems in the state, that the possibility of an invasion could be minimized, and then that the Soviet Union could protect its borders much better than it had done in 1941. Now, there's a very telling quote, if we move to slide number 5, made by a Montenegrin communist, a Yugoslav communist, a man called Milovan Djilas. He was a delegate of the Yugoslav communists who visited Moscow and who visited Stalin for negotiations several times from sort of 1946 until 1947. And he wrote a book in the 1950s, which was quite soon published in English, about his experiences in the Kremlin, and about his meetings with Stalin. It's quite a short book. You'll be relieved to hear it's only about 120 pages, but it's a fascinating insight, not entirely reliable, but nevertheless a fascinating insight into the mentality of the Politburo, Stalin's mentality, the way that he's making decisions at the end of the Second World War. It can be at times quite a terrifying one. Djilas describes at the Kremlin very long drunken dinners, classic sort of Russian style, huge amounts of food. Eating would begin at sort of midnight. Vodka would be passed around, and then by about 3 a.m, Stalin would kind of clear the table, bring out the maps, and in this kind of everyone in this drunken state, he would start deciding borders with Albania and borders with Bulgaria and borders with the Baltic states. So it's kind of fascinating to think that these unbelievably critical decisions which would shape the Cold War, according to Djilas, were made in this sort of in this kind of fog of sort of alcohol and sort of overeating and sort of bonhomie. It's quite a terrifying account. But anyway, for a very long time during the Cold War, but ideas have slightly been modified now because we have more access to sources. But during the Cold War, Djilas was one of the key sources. And one of the most famous quotes that he attributes to Stalin when talking about Central and Eastern Europe and talking about territory is the following one. I put it up on slide number 5. Stalin is quoted as saying by Djilas, this war is not as in the past. Whoever occupies a territory imposes upon it his own social system. It cannot be otherwise. And what historians took this to mean was that Stalin, with the Red Army in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, having made these military conquests, these military victories, would not simply leave it at that. He would not sort of exit the territories. He would stay there, but moreover, this was the first step towards a full blown political transformation. The quote that Gilas is attributing to Stalin was taken by many historians to mean that it was always Stalin's intention to sort of establish communist regimes in the countries that he now occupied. So that is the countries that we're interested in. Countries like Czechoslovakia, countries like Poland, countries like Romania, countries like Bulgaria, countries, of course, like the Baltic states. In slide number 6, I put up an image of the cover of Gilas's book, which is now available in a pretty cheap Penguin Classics editions. You can get that for sort of like €10, even cheaper on Kindle. We do have it in the library. I also do have a copy. If I can ever get back into my office and anyone ever dares come back onto campus, then we can we can have a look at that. We will be coming back a lot to Gilas, incidentally, when we come to the Balkans, and when we come to Yugoslavia. Gilas is one of the most interesting and one of the most candid commentators on this region. He writes a lot about Yugoslavia, writes a lot about Tito, writes a lot about the Soviet Union, about the communist world, and does so in quite an honest way. And we'll see why that is, and then we'll talk more about Gilas in the coming weeks. Okay, now this having said that having used this Gilas quote to sort of indicate what Stalin was intending, I want to try to make this a little bit more complicated, a little bit more ambiguous by also pointing out that people's ideas have changed since the end of the Cold War. People's ideas about Stalin's policy and about how the communist parties took over in Eastern Central Europe have changed as well. Once upon a time, it was believed, during the Cold War, it was believed that Stalin had a very rigid plan for taking over these countries. He wanted each of these countries to have a replica communist government, just like the Soviet Union. This was his plan from page 1, and he very meticulously, very ruthlessly executed it. And what happened with the communist takeovers throughout Eastern and Central Europe was precisely according to Stalin's plan. Now that has changed a little bit since the Cold War, since the archives in Russia and the Politburo archives opened up, and people looked at them, and people got a slightly better idea of what was happening in this region. People have started to realize that maybe, after all, Stalin was a little bit more flexible. Maybe he was waiting to see what the Western powers did. Maybe it was the Marshall Plan, which the Soviets believed was a very sort of aggressive move into their territory. Maybe it wasn't quite as clear cut as people once thought. The reading that I've assigned for this week by Norman Naimark, which should be accessible as an e-copy in the library, explains this kind of ambiguity and takes a much more cautious approach to this sort of Stalin's policies. Now, whatever the interpretation, and this is really a question of interpretation, his allies on the ground in Central and Eastern Europe were, of course, the communists, and we've met them briefly a couple of times, and now we're going to stick with them in a much more concerted fashion for the rest of the module. I'm on slide number 7. So the communists had a difficult and a strange history since the end of the First World War. In Central and Eastern Europe, and immediately after the First World War, in many countries, the communist parties had been pretty popular. Popular with soldiers returning from the front, popular with workers, popular with people who sort of felt disillusioned and disoriented by the conflict and by the war and these sorts of things. So they had began, at least in the early 1920s, as quite popular political movements. That had changed as the 1920s wore on. In many cases, the communists has been banned. In fact, in almost all cases, the communist parties have been pushed away from the sort of the electoral processes. They had been outlawed. They had been made illegal in the interwar period. The one exception, as I've mentioned in last week's sessions, was Czechoslovakia. The police had hounded them. They'd imprisoned them, and as a result of this, the communist parties, the communist movement in Central and Eastern Europe, had gone from a sort of large popular electoral force and had been transformed in the 1920s into sort of a much smaller but hardened underground revolutionary movement. Now, they had also been tied, of course, to the Soviet Union, increasingly so. Each communist party in the region had its own national representation. Most of them were members of the Communist International, so the network of international communist parties. Ostensibly, those were equal members, fraternal members, but in reality, they were subordinate to the Soviet Party. And increasingly in the 1930s, the Comintern itself, the Communist International, was subordinate to the interests of Stalin. Now, they were very much this, they're very much the cat's paws, if you like, of Stalin's policy. Now, on the plus side, the communist parties were not tainted at all with collaboration. We spoke about that in last week's sessions, didn't we? And we saw how various political groups made accommodations, whether they wanted to or not, with the Axis collaborators. The communists had not done this from 1941 onwards. When the Soviet Union was attacked by Nazi Germany, the communists had entered the battle, and they had done so, it must be said, in a pretty heroic fashion, a pretty brave fashion. They had confronted the occupier. They had called upon their days of illegality in the interwar period, and they had been quite, they had taken the fight, if you like, to the occupier. Now, in addition to this, their fortunes were ascending because, as I mentioned earlier in the lecture, of the ascending prestige and the ascending victory of the Soviet Union itself. The sort of the capital, the cachet of the Soviet Union and of Stalin was rising. It was at an all-time high at the end of the Second World War, as I've mentioned before, and as a result of this, also the various communist parties had they had a lot of prestige as well. Now, they had also, during the Second World War, entered, just as the Soviet Union had, into alliances with the democratic forces. And this would prove to be extremely important in the coming processes of takeover. A policy since the communists since the end of the 1930s had been part of what was called the policy of the Popular Front. And the Popular Front policy dictated, it was dictated by the Comintern, so dictated by the Soviet Union, and the Popular Front dictated that communists should enter into alliances with non-communist democratic forces in order to resist the rise of fascism. This policy had been outlined in 1937, I think at the 7th Comintern meeting, which was held in Moscow, and this was the sort of the international policy of the Communist Party, and it held right through the Second World War, right up until the end of the Second World War. So what this meant was that the communists were not outsiders in the political process anymore. They had formed alliances, they had formed coalition governments with democratic forces, those that had not been tainted by collaboration, and they had a kind of modus operandi. They had a way of working with non-communist forces, and this went right the way to the very top. This was the policy that Stalin was pursuing when he dealt with Winston Churchill, when he dealt with Roosevelt, and when he dealt with Truman. His policy was, this is Popular Front, we're communists, we want a communist revolution, but for the time being, the most urgent crisis, the most urgent threat is that of fascism. This has to be defeated. and until it has been defeated, it's permissible to cooperate and to collaborate with non-communist forces. Now, if we turn to slide number 9, just very briefly, I want you to introduce you to another very important figure in East Central European communism, the Bulgarian communist Georgy Dimitrov. Dimitrov had been a member of the Bulgarian Party, and as some of you may remember, if you recall my lectures on trials. You may recall that Georgy Dimitrov was the man who was wrongly accused of burning the Reichstag down in Weimar, Germany in 1934. He was put on trial and he became an instant celebrity because of his performance in this trial. Outsmarting the Nazis, outsmarting Goering, giving a very good account of himself whilst in the dock in Nazi Germany. So Dimitrov had become a very important figure in international communism, and as a result of this Reichstag fire performance, this trial performance, he had now become the General Secretary of the Communist International, so the General Secretary of the Comintern, and it was Dimitrov who sort of announced in 1937 the introduction of the Popular Front, outlined its terms, explained the terms to the assembled communists. Dimitrov kept a diary during the Second World War, had incredible access to Stalin, and his diary is accessible, it's available. We have it in the library, it's been translated into English, and it's one of the key sources on communism during the Second World War. So if anybody's interested in writing about this period, writing about Dimitrov, his diaries, the Dimitrov diaries are an extremely good and an extremely important source. Okay, so what that means is that at the end of the Second World War, the communists, backed by the Soviet Union, throughout Eastern and Central Europe and throughout Europe entirely, throughout continental Europe, have entered into the Popular Front with non-communist forces, and in all cases in Central and Eastern Europe are now part of the ruling coalition governments that will take over at the end of the Second World War. So each European country, including France, Italy, but also Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, at the end of the Second World War constructed coalition governments of national unity, which included a broad spectrum of political forces, not those that had been tainted with collaboration, but including the communists. And the communists were a very important component of those coalition governments because of their role in the resistance, because in many cases of their popularity in the country, and because of the importance also of the Soviet Union. Now, it seemed that what happened next, how the communists maneuvered their way through these coalition governments and into complete control of the countries in question, proceeded in 3 stages. And the 3 stages are outlined on slide number 10. And again, the story is that this was the instructions of Stalin to his local communist parties. The 3 stages were as followed. The first phase was the so-called phase of genuine coalition. Within the terms of the Popular Front, communists were operating with non-communists. They were part of these democratic governments. They were playing fairly. They were playing the rules. Not of revolution, not of communist revolution, but of participatory parliamentary politics, and this is essentially what was happening in the initial phase right after the end of the Second World War. But apparently what was changing during this time was that the communists were pivoting to a less conciliatory position. During the period of the Popular Front, they were maneuvering themselves so that, in fact, within the coalitions, they controlled the most important offices of state, the ones that would be most useful should they need to sort of carry out some kind of seizure of power, some kind of coup. Now, it differed from state to state, but usually what this meant was things like the police, things like the media, right? So newspapers, radio. If they controlled these things, if they controlled the radio, if they controlled the press, for example, then they were able to use those to sort of broadcast smears of their democratic opponents, claiming that they had collaborated during the Second World War, claiming that they had profiteered during the Second World War, claiming that they were not acting within the interests of the people within these countries. In countries like Poland, they took over the Ministry of Land Reform. This was an extremely important ministry because it meant that they were in charge of distributing land parcels, and they could do that only to only to people who promised political support for the communists. So again, another way of exerting power. Now, in the past, in the Cold War, people called the second phase the phase of bogus coalition. They said that what's happening now is that the communists, ostensibly, superficially, they are in these democratic governments, but in practical terms, they're maneuvering themselves so they control the most important offices of state. This is not a real coalition. This is simply a shell coalition, which the communists are exerting, their own power over. People equivocate now. It's not as clear that Stalin was so ruthless and so aggressive, would you believe, in his policies, but it is certainly true, and I think this is an important point about this second phase. From 1945 to 1947, it is certainly true that relations between Stalin and the Western powers, so between the United States and Great Britain, are deteriorating rapidly. Stalin is becoming increasingly suspicious of what Churchill and what Truman are doing. This grand coalition, which held relatively well, seemed to hold relatively well, whilst the job of defeating and killing the fascists was still to be done. Once it had been done, all of a sudden it was clear that there was very little in common, as you can imagine, between a man like Winston Churchill and one like Joseph Stalin. So the cracks were emerging. Stalin was becoming more paranoid about what the Western powers were doing, and he was instructing also his communists on the ground to treat their non-communist partners, who of course were backed by the Westerners, backed by the West, to exercise more caution, to be careful, because Stalin felt that something was happening here. Now, really, the turning point, it seems, was the Marshall Plan, announced in 1947. Depending on your politics and depending on your interpretation, the Marshall Plan is perhaps quite a benign aid package which the Americans offered to Europe and all of Europe, with the intention of getting these states back on, getting their trading partners back on their feet. What it looked like to Moscow, what it looked like to Stalin, was an aggressive sort of form of imperialism. That the capitalists were using the modes of the capitalist economy via the Marshall Plan to push right back into Europe and push right up against the nose of the Soviet Union. And again, remember, Stalin, congenitally a paranoid person, but somebody who is deeply fearful of the security concerns of the Soviet Union at the end of the Second World War. Now, from 1947 to 1948, and maybe 1949 in certain cases, the third stage is executed. Whether it was always Stalin's plan or whether this was just a response to the Marshall Plan and to Western policies and the perception of Western policies, Stalin instructs his local communists to immediately execute a takeover of power, to create some kind of pretext to use their control with the police, with the army, with the media, with the interior ministry, to sort of break down these coalition forces, to break down these coalition governments and seize power completely. And this is completed by about 1949. 1948, 1949, Stalin and the communists are in complete control throughout the area that we're interested in. Now, it happens in different fashions depending on the country in question. And, you know, this is something you can look up more in Naimark's book, because it has a series of case studies where he can see sort of what's happening in individual countries. But I can just give you a couple of examples maybe. Take a country like Poland. We'll talk more about it in this afternoon's in the second session when we talk about Czeslaw Milosz. But the Polish, to cut a long story very short, a very long story short, the Communist Party had never been a major political force within Poland. It had always been a minority. It had always been basically restricted to Warsaw, the capital. Did not have a mass base of support broadly across the country. So it was quite small. There were much more favorable political forces, political parties in Poland at the end of the Second World War. However, in contrast, Stalin believed completely that if he did not control Poland, he would be prone to some kind of attack from the West. That Poland was the key to the strategic defense of the Western marches of the Soviet Union. It goes right back to Lenin's time, right back to the 1920s, where the Soviets always believed that Poland was the key between the Soviet Union and Germany, and if they could control Poland, they would be relatively safe. Their western borders would be relatively safe. What this meant was that Stalin had to exert a huge amount of pressure on the Poles in order to secure this country into the communist bloc. Remember that there was the Home Army, this massive non-communist resistance movement. This needed to be dealt with. Stalin had a huge amount of work to do to secure Poland into the communist bloc, but secure it he did. And successfully, with a lot of coercion, successfully managed to sort of secure the country into the Soviet bloc. Now, in contrast, a country like Czechoslovakia had a very different trajectory into the Soviet bloc. Czechoslovakia, the Communist Party had always been legal within, throughout the interwar period. It had never been outside of the law. We're on page number 12, slide number 12. So the Communist Party had always been legal, and as a result of this, it had fared pretty well in elections. Now, because of Munich and because of the Second World War, because of this, the perceived betrayal, of the Western Allies during the Munich crisis, liberal forces and Western forces were not held in very high regard by many people, particularly the younger generation within Czechoslovakia. They looked instead to the Soviet Union. They had seen how it had fared during the Second World War. They had seen the successes of its army and its political cadres, and they looked eastwards rather than westwards. In open elections, relatively fair and free elections held in May 1945, the Communists were by far the most popular party. They polled about 38%, which was the largest faction, the largest share of votes within Czechoslovakia. They did extremely well, and it was a reflection of the sincere popularity of the Communist Party within Czechoslovakia. Now, the coup in Czechoslovakia, we'll talk about it more, and sometimes I worry that because of my fascination with Czechoslovakia, I end up turning this module entirely into a study of that country. So I won't talk too much about it, but I will just say that the coup came in February 1948. There were significant elements of coercion. The communist appeal had sort of died down a little bit, but nevertheless, within Czechoslovak society, the Communist Party continued to be a pretty popular political force. It didn't its star did not sort of decline significantly during this period. Now we could go on, but I'm not going to. I'm going to sort of leave the slideshow there because again, time is almost up. But I will say the following thing. If you look at Neinmark's book, you can go case by case through the various countries, and you can see that there are different levels of coercion, different levels of popularity for the communist parties in each of these states. So in countries like Poland, there was basically a civil war. A lot of violence. The NKVD and the Red Army really had to force themselves upon the Polish society. In countries like Czechoslovakia and other countries in Central Europe, maybe Bulgaria would be another example. The fit was a little bit better. Not exactly smooth, but the local communist parties could rely upon certain elements of support within the societies in question. So the takeovers of power were not quite so dramatic. It should also be said that although there was and we'll learn more about this in the coming weeks, there was imprisonment, there was violence, there was killing, there was executions carried out by the communists to ensure that their political regimes would succeed. If there was a choice, the communists genuinely preferred to try to persuade people to try to go into the villages, to try to go into the factories, and compel people to join the party, compel people to support their revolution by persuading them of the superiority of their revolution, of the superiority of their political model. Given the choice, they would rather do that than try to sort of terrorize and force people. But if they had to, they would do that as well. Each country is different, and thinking to the approaching national case studies, you could start to think about how these takeovers are affected and how existing national traditions do or do not sort of segue smoothly into the communist model. In each country, the situation happens differently, and we'll talk more about those in coming weeks. This is the last moment of political contestation. The communist parties will now, from 48, 49, right up until 1989. That's 4 decades, 40 years, 2 generations. So yours and your parents' generation, for example, will now live exclusively and only under communist rule. Okay, thank you.